You've done 30 years of research, you suddenly go, oh, what might the impact be on the world?
Just push through. Don't feel. Real men don't cry. Sound familiar? That's not resilience, that's dissociation.
So what that then taught me and taught the other boys is that's weak if you show your anger, if you try and hit someone.
In elite institutions that mold boys into leaders. But what happens when those boys grow up and start running countries, corporations, and your life?
The transition from boy to man is service. Warrior is on bended knee, how may I serve?
This episode tears down the myth of toughness and asks what we've really sacrificed to look strong.
IQ is just 20% of life successes. The other 80% is to do with emotional intelligence. Are we actually teaching resilience to our companies and our children, or are we teaching dissociation?
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Hello, welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with Piers Cross. He is a leadership coach, an author, and a documentarian. He actually recently released a documentary called Boarding on Insanity, where he looks at boarding school and the effect that it has on the young people across the world. So I'm really excited to have you on the show, Piers. This is going to be a really unique and interesting episode. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's really great to be here, and it feels a bit strange to be on the other side as I interviewed you a few weeks ago.
Right, yeah. I was just on your show. Listeners can check that out. But yeah, it was a really great conversation. I couldn't wait to have you back on because the boarding school angle, it's so unique. I haven't spoken with anyone in my 5 years of doing this show that focuses on that. So I'm excited just to really dig into that niche of reality, you know, that part that I think doesn't really get talked about in the way that you are talking about it, you know, the reality of what it's like to be in boarding school.
Yeah, I think it's one of those elephants in the room. And, you know, even for the US, I think, Donald Trump went to boarding school, JFK went to boarding school, and you just realize, and then obviously across the globe, how many of our leaders went to these schools. And, you know, if you marry it up with a lot of the research which has been done into this field, Joy Chavrian, who died sadly a few weeks ago, but she'd done 30 years of research, professor into this work, and Nick Duffel, and you suddenly go, oh, what might the impact be on the world?
Yeah. Well, so let's start with your personal story, because I think in America, boarding school is almost like fetishized. I think of like Hogwarts, you know, or like the young adult fiction where you have, it's almost this like idyllic thing, right? Of like everyone's prim and proper, and, you know, you get the best education and you join like a house and a team and you have a, you know, uniform, but that can't be the reality. So I'm curious from your experience, like what is it actually like?
Yeah. So, I mean, my story is I grew up in a military family. My father went to boarding school. My godfather was boarding school. My uncle and my grandfather on my mother's side, boarding school, aunt. It was the done thing that you go to boarding school. So age 11, I went to boarding school. I asked to go because I struggled with my dad, who was an ex-boarder, so made sense. And when I got there, I think first 3 weeks, it was great. I really enjoyed it. It was, you know, be away from family. It was like, oh, you know, all sport. And then after 3 weeks, my mother didn't turn up for a leave day, so you'd be able to go home once every 3 weeks, or if you were playing sport, every 6 weeks. And I couldn't see my mother, and suddenly I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I've had enough. It was a nice holiday camp. It's time to go home, and I realized I couldn't go home anymore. And from being quite upbeat and in a positive space, I started to go more inward, and I remember crying one night and the whole dormitory coming into my cubicle and laughing at me, shouting, "You're not so cool, Cross. You know, you thought you were tough, or you thought you were cool, and you're not, you're weak." And I made a kind of decision that night that I would never cry again. And I never did at school. And I didn't cry for years, even at my father's funeral, and one of my friend's funeral. And so externally, I became very tough, you know, passive aggressive. People kept away from me. I was very good at sports. And on the surface, I seemed like I was a success. But it was only when I had a breakdown later on in my 20s, I was homeless for a period of time. I'd, you know, gone to business school, European business school, spent time in France, in London, worked in the financial sector, and I had a breakdown. And it was at that point that I started to unpick and go, actually, boarding school was horrific.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about the breakdown, but let's dive into the boarding school a little bit more. For our listeners out there, can you tell them, like, what a typical day is like? You know, what was it like to go through that? And I'm also curious, like, how much, you know, teacher interaction you had, how much were you just around the kids with no supervision? Like what's a day in the life?
Great question. Yeah, so I think this is one of the principal issues with boarding school is this, what Nick Duffel calls the timetabling. So all of your day is structured. There's no free time. So from 7 o'clock in the morning, you're woken, and then 7:30 is breakfast. You know, I went back to my old school 10 days ago. It was a gathering for sexual abuse survivors. It was about 60 or 70 of us there. And we went into the dining room. We had food there. And it's literally, it used to be the biggest unsupported roof in Europe. So it can seat up to 900 people in one sitting. And, you know, so you go to have breakfast in this place. And then after breakfast, you then have, you know, cubicle inspection. Then you have chapel or chapel practice. Then you have lessons. And then you have a break for 15 minutes. The school is so big that it takes a long time to get back to your house. So sometimes you stay out. Then you have more lessons. We used to march into lunch, which some people see quite strange, but it's like we had a 100-piece marching band, and we would march to the tune of boom, 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 boom. And so we were marching in 6 days a week. We wouldn't do it on Sunday. And then after noon would either be lessons, or we'd do sport in wintertime after lunch, and then it'd be lessons later on when it got dark. And then tea times, so obviously tea time would be then 6 o'clock. After, we'd maybe have a half an hour break, and then we got prep. So we'd have to sit down at desks and study. And then maybe half an hour after that, then it was dead time for bed. So you were just one place to the other. So the idea was that you didn't have the space to feel, really. You just got to keep going, keep going, keep going. And the other reason, as some historians have pointed out, was in the 1800s, there was quite a lot of problems in boarding schools, a lot of bullying, a lot of fighting. It was just a feral place. And so they brought in this timetabling to make sure that didn't happen. And in regards to teachers, so we had, you know, in classrooms, it was probably 20 to 25 people in the class. So quite small classes. But then back in the boarding houses where we spent most of our time, you've got 50 students to one teacher.
Yeah.
And people don't quite understand that. But if you think of, if you were to, do you have children, Mark?
No, but hopefully soon.
Yeah. So if you can imagine having 2 children, and you've got to look after 2 children, and then someone says to you, can you look after an extra 48 children?
Yeah.
I mean, it's insane.
It's like having 49 siblings and one parent, right? Like, it just doesn't work. Yeah.
It doesn't work. It's like, so what happens is it's the other children end up doing the looking after, and they've been taught by other children. And so it's like the word that often comes to me from clients is Lord of the Flies. It's dog eat dog, often it's people who might be a couple of months older become the monitors. They can punish you. The older boys often would cane the younger boys. They'd have permission to do that, or they'd send them to the housemaster or teachers to be caned. So I think, that was, you had very little interaction with, and in my school in the 90s, we used to still have fagging, which meant, it was kind of Tom Brown school days, which meant you'd have to go and make them toast or go and do chores for them. And, in Eton, they used to have this thing where someone would shout, one of the seniors, fag, and then everyone used to have to run, the young boys had to run to that boy's study, and the last boy would have to go and do the chore. So that was kind of it. It's like you've always got something to do. And what that means is, we talked about on our podcast about emotional intelligence. There was no space for emotions. If you got angry, if you cried, you would be humiliated. There was one boy on my year in my house who couldn't control his anger. And so how we dealt with that as the collective was we used to go around, shout at him, psycho, psycho, until he would hit someone and we'd all start laughing at him. So what that then taught me and taught the other boys is like, you don't show your anger. That's weak if you show your anger, if you try and hit someone. So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's like gang justice, right? Or gang violence. We could have like Lord of the Flies, it's just kids trying to come up with some self-governance. Yeah, and it sounds like, I'm curious, like, it sounds like it was endorsed by the teachers or by the monitors that were there. Like they endorsed like the corporal punishment, or they like were okay with it, or were they just not aware of everything that was going on behind closed doors?
Yeah, it's just really strange. I mean, one is we all thought it was normal, so it's normalized. As Nick Duffel called boarding school, normalized neglect. So it's just normal. So for me, I always thought I was lucky because I didn't get the bullying that the other boys got. But interesting, looking through my journals, and I was seeing friends from school a week ago, and I was just reading some of my notes as an 11-year-old boy, and I said, oh, today I got beatings from the third form. Oh, I went upstairs and I got hit round the head and kicked in the leg. And this was just the normal thing. It's just like, they just punch you, So it wasn't a safe place. And I think they're aware of it. But again, if you've got 49, 50 children and you're just one adult, one thing is you learn, and this was something that George Orwell wrote about, who wrote 1984. I mean, George Orwell, he went to boarding school, and psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk in The Body Keeps the Score, he says he believes that was based on his boarding school experience in 1984. Yeah.
Yeah, the level of just like control and manipulation, right? Propaganda.
Yeah, the double think.
Yeah.
Which is what they, Judith Herman talks about in the first page of Trauma and Recovery, is saying doublethink is basically dissociation. And I'd been kind of, it dropped in a couple of days ago. I was listening to someone speak on LinkedIn, and they were talking about resilience. And I suddenly thought, yeah, what we are selling in corporations at the moment about resilience is actually dissociation. It's not resilience. We're telling people just to keep going and, not feel and, push through it. It's like, that's not resilience.
Yeah.
That's dissociation.
Compartmentalize it and power through, right? Which I imagine is part of what you were learning at boarding school, right? This idea of just like keep moving no matter what, and don't stand out. I'm curious about the conformity piece. I mean, the way you talk about it, I've had a number of veterans on the show, and it seems very similar to like older versions of the Army. I think it has changed significantly, or from what I've heard in the past 10 years, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, it seems very similar to what you're talking about, of like just kind of turn everybody into the same boy, you know? Was that your experience, trying to make you like more of a collective and destroy your
very much so.
individuality?
I mean,
Yeah.
one is that you have the same uniform, so everyone's wearing the same clothing. You know, the girls obviously had skirts, but essentially the same, stockings. My uniform was 16th century uniform, so it was a long black coat, white piece of cloth, buttons, a belt, breeches to your knees, and woolen socks to your knees. So
Really? They
it
hadn't
was
updated since the 16th century? It was like the same thing?
same thing. Yeah.
Wow.
You know, and
Okay.
it was like, you know, we used to have wear it everywhere, even going into town. And they changed that ruling recently because kids were being beaten in town because it was quite obvious where they were from. So they're like, oh, you don't have to wear it anymore. So by having that uniform, you're kind of, you become part of the collective. And there's all the rules about how you can wear the uniform. So, you know, that's one of the thing about these schools, it's very hierarchical. So as you get older, you can walk certain places. You know, the adults can walk on the grass, the children can't walk on the grass. You know, for me, we had these belts, and the belt we called trying to think what the belt was called. Was it a girdle? I think it was called a girdle. The first year you had to wear it with the buckle at the front. The second year you could move the buckle to the back. And if you had it in the wrong place, then someone would go, oi, get the buckle in the right place. There's all these rules. So you had to conform. And I think that's one of the things about these places. I see that Bessel van der Kolk talks about. Again, he says, when we are in fear, there's no neural activity. We go into freeze. So it's very difficult to think. It's very difficult to really learn in that space. And because there's so many rules and you're trying not to mess up, I felt I was in fear most of the time.
Yeah, and that makes you very impressionable too, right? Like I said, if you're focused on everything and not getting in trouble, then you don't have that higher order of thinking. Well, was there any time to be an individual? Like, was individual expression, maybe this is me as an American, right? Trying to, I know that's such a big part of our ethos, right? But like, you mentioned a journal. Like, was there time to be on your own or to figure out who you were? Or is everything, it feels like everything was in a group. You know, everything is just part of a bigger system.
Yeah. So for me, I was there from just after my 11th birthday. So, a couple of months after I turned 11. And until I was 16, I had no door or any privacy. When I was 16, I had my first door and I had to share a space with one other boy. Then when I was 17, so 6 years I'd been there at that point, I got my first time I could have privacy. The downstairs toilets had doors on. Upstairs toilets didn't, nor did showers, nor did baths, nor did our cubicles until I'm 16. So we weren't allowed in the dormitory during the day. And, so you had to be in the communal space, or you had to be doing some form of activity so everyone's watching you. Eton was slightly different. Not all boarding schools are like mine. But Eton, you had your own study, so you could have your own space. But that's rare. I haven't heard many where you had your own space. And certainly, it was kind of certainly in my school frowned upon for you to be alone. So you had to, and what I think psychologically, what happens, again, Joy Chavrian says, you build up this carapace, this wall, because you have no space, your privacy, you've got to become dissociated. You build up, you keep people at arm's length, and you're breaking that attachment with your parents. Then what's happening is then you become avoidant attachment, you become insecurely attached, and you push people away. Relationships aren't important. So you become quite cold. you build them, emotionally there. So it's like, I often hear this from my clients, is like, I can't connect to people, or I especially with my children or my wife, it's like, I can't let them in because they're behind this wall. And that's part of the work I do with them, is like, let's take that wall down, and people say, okay, but actually in business as well, if you're a salesperson or a CEO and you have a wall up in between you and your staff, well, how can they have empathy? Because a lot of the unconscious processes are unconscious. So you're closing your body language up. It's not very easy for you to kind of connect with others and it really excel.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think Western culture, maybe America, is like the spearhead, is so focused on efficiency, right, that there's no room for connection, because connection is messy. It's inefficient by nature. It's slow. It's more artistic and creative, right? Like, it's not about getting a task done. It's just about being with somebody else. So I see that in many of the men I work with too. It's just this hyper focus on efficiency and transaction, right? Like, what am I getting out of this moment? Is this valuable to me? Right. Which, like, if you apply that to connection, it's just going to fail, right? It becomes a very, in its most extreme, like a narcissistic way of connecting, where everything is just about, is it meeting your own needs or not? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you wanted to open up, but you were afraid that it wouldn't be taken well? You ask yourself, what's the point? Nothing's going to change anyway. So you do what you always do. You push it down, numb out the pain with a drink, a night out, or pornography. I've been there myself, and I know that men lack the outlets for emotional expression, which is why I founded Men's Therapy Online, a healing hub for men's mental health. If you've been knocked on your ass or just crave meaningful connection, join Men's Therapy Online, a community of men who just get it. We offer individual therapy, men's groups, and powerful retreats, all led by licensed therapists. At Men's Therapy Online, we will help you to get back on your feet and take your life to the next level. Start your journey today at menstherapy.online.
Yeah. It's like, if we come to the archetypal, the work of Jungian analyst Robert Moore, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I know you said you were doing that in your group. It's the difference between boy and man. Boy, it's all about me. It's like, which is important. It's an important stage. We've got to find out who we are. But then the transition from boy to man is service. It's like the warrior is on bended knee. How may I serve? And I see that most of us as men are still in boy, because it's all about me. What can I get? What's in it for me? Rather than, I need to serve here. I need to give of my all to my wife or my children or to my work, to the people, rather than what can I get?
Yeah. Do you feel like the boarding school, like, because I imagine, I guess my naive understanding, on paper, it talks about that. It talks about instilling that in people, in kids, turning them into servant leaders or things like that. But what I'm hearing from you is it's at the opposite. It kind of doubles down on that boy psychology. Would you agree with that?
Totally. It's not an initiation. It's like, if it is, it's a bit like the military. And military is an initiation, but it's an immature initiation. It's not it's like, I think Robert Moore says this, is like, we take people off to war, but we never bring them back. So therefore they really struggle when they come back, because they've been initiated, but they've not been held by an elder to transition back. And it's the same with boarding school. We go off, but we never come back. We never come home. It's very interesting that people who go to boarding school, they will often leave their home. So I'm from Portsmouth. I've never really been back to Portsmouth. I spent 6 months there since I was 11. And obviously I'd go back at holiday times. So I think, we never really return home. And I think that's really sad, but it's also home within ourselves, to our authenticity. We've become what the school wanted us to be this successful person. But actually we see now that we might look externally successful, but internally we're very poor. And as Daniel Goleman's work is now showing, his IQ is just 20% of life successes. The other 80% is to do with emotional intelligence. These schools only teach the IQ aspect. And as he points out in a recent video, Daniel Goleman, this is going to be outsourced, the IQ part, by AI. He says what's going to be important in the coming years is the EQ of these leaders. But they're not learning any EQ in these schools. And they might say, oh, yeah, we're teaching. I had a conversation with the head teacher a week ago at my school. I said, emotional intelligence is really important. I said, are you teaching it? And he says, no. We're teaching other things, but we're not teaching emotional intelligence. And really, emotional intelligence comes from interacting with a community, a wide range of all ages, with your parents, interacting, not with people who are just the same age as you. And that's really what happens in these schools. It's probably very similar in America. In all schools, you don't really talk to the older kids because they're cool and they think you're really uncool. You're just, a little kid.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think in most public schools, that is the case. I know I've talked to a couple of educators on the show, and in some private schools or some areas, they are doing more cross-class interactions, but it has to be mandated because naturally it doesn't happen. That mentorship or that, greater community you're talking about, I don't think really happens, which is a shame because I agree. I mean, EQ comes from life experience. It comes from resolving conflict. It comes from doing things when you're scared and, helping, boost up your buddy, right? It's all those little micro moments build that EQ. It's very hard to teach that, You mentioned earlier, and if you're willing to talk about it, being a sexual abuse survivor. Did that happen at the boarding school? Is that a common thing?
That happened to me. Yeah. So, my story is, and I share it in my documentary, is age 14, I was depressed, and I used to talk to one guy called Rick, and one day he committed suicide, and he jumped in front of the train, and, it was a real shock, obviously, trauma. I dissociated even more. And as me and a few others, we were told to go and see the priest, to go and speak to him. And he sexually abused me, the priest. It's like my lowest time. This has just happened. And it's like, what the hell? So I went and I hid in the woods for 3 months. And that's what really saved me, is being able to go and I used to build a den and, just spend time in nature, feet on the floor. It was just really lovely. And I was sexually abused, and there was a lot of sexual abuse in my school. And often there is in these schools. I believe one of the leading researchers, he said that he has a database of up to 1,400 names of people who have been abused in these schools. He says it's up to 50% of boarding schools have allegations of sexual abuse against them. And the reason being is that, your parents aren't around. They miss the little cues that, if I come home at the end of the day and my parents see I'm crying, or I won't talk, or I won't eat, they'll go, what's wrong with you? And eventually it will come out that I've been sexually abused. They're going to know, unless they're totally dissociated as parents, they might not notice. But most parents, good enough parents, will notice that. Whereas if you don't see them for 3 weeks or 3 months, or, I know people who saw their parents once a year because they were in Africa, you have no idea what's going on for them. And so therefore the predators just can keep going. And the reality is, Mark, is that only 1 in 9 sexual abuse survivors actually speak up.
Yep.
I often hear this.
Men, it's way lower, right? As men, we don't talk about that.
Exactly, because there's so much shame around that. And also, when we're in a position of power, which many men who've been to these schools get to, you're not going to want to admit that you've been sexually abused. Rupert Soames, Winston Churchill's grandson, he came out about a month ago to say he'd been sexually abused. More people are now speaking up. It's kind of, it's prevalent, the sexual abuse in these schools. It's very sad.
Yeah, it's very sad. It's crazy to talk about it because, I mean, that's the only way these predators get caught, right? And the system changes, is to know what's going on behind closed doors there. And I imagine, like the hurt people idea, you have people that have come up in that system. And from what I'm gathering from our conversation, so much of it is about dominance, hierarchy, control, power. I think one way that men, express that is sexually. So it's probably just another lever of control. And that's horrible. I'm sorry that is something that happens to, who knows how many young boys. Because like you said, it's probably underreported. It certainly is underreported,
Yeah, it is underreported, and I think, that power. In my school, there was an article when one of the teachers was sent away to prison. I mean, 6 of my actual teachers are in prison or have spent time and they've been released, and I think another 5 from other schools.
For sexual abuse allegations or for a
yeah,
variety
for rape, sexual abuse.
Damn, that's a lot. 6? That's a lot.
Yeah, and there's another 5 which were arrested in other schools. So whether they were sexually abusing in our school, I don't know. But yeah, that is a lot. I think it was and that's the interesting thing, looking through my diary, I'm like, oh, I was being taught by this guy. He was my French teacher. He was arrested. That was my history teacher. Yeah, he was arrested. Oh, that was the priest. Oh, yeah, he was arrested. Oh, that guy as well. Yeah, he was arrested. You're like, yeah, it's like, it's not a safe environment to be around, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. And even if they're actively abusing you,
and it was only later on we're like,
mindset,
oh my God,
right?
all
there's
the
still
stories were true.
toxicity that's probably coming off of them.
Our way of dealing with the trauma, the unsafety, was to make a joke out of it. So yeah.
Trying to offer some version of a warning of whatever is possible, right? Of like, really don't go into this house. That's crazy. Okay, well, so let's move forward in your story a bit, right? Because you mentioned that breakdown, and I imagine you're certainly not alone in that. So I'm curious, using your story as an example, and then probably talking about other, people that have been out of boarding school. I imagine at some point it unravels. Because like you said, you're kind of hyper specialized in one thing, but they didn't teach you, or you lacked the skills to deal with real life, I'd imagine, right? Because it was all, trauma and dissociation and all that.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't really, for me, I left. I got a job in the financial sector in London, working as a salesman. And, on the surface, my partner, she was, working for banking, and I connected with her again, and she's like very high up in the banking industry, almost the top president. It's like, that was the world that I was in. And I see that on the surface, it was like I lived in a very luxurious part of London, near Hampstead Heath. I, worked for one of the top Fortune 500 companies. And yet I was so miserable. I was drinking quite a lot, taking drugs. And all around me, that was the environment of, I was working with exporters. It's like, and what I found is that, and again, coming back to Judith Herman, she says, usually when we've been dissociating, that works for the first 10, 20 years after you've, So she said by the 3rd or the 4th decade, that's when almost what you squashed down into the basement, it comes back up again to bite you on your backside. And I've worked one-to-one with people who've been really successful in their 20s, but then they come and they go, I can't do it anymore, because they've just been dissociating. And it only works for a period of time. When boarding schools often say, oh, boarding school creates resilience. And I reply, no, it doesn't. It creates dissociation, which is why that's been that link for me recently, is that, are we actually teaching resilience to our companies and our children, or are we teaching dissociation? And so, yeah. So for me, I see that for me, it didn't last very long, because my early experience has been so horrible. A couple of years, and I was like, I obviously was at business school for 4 years, but I got to age 25, 26, and I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I can't split off anymore. And I one day decided to leave my partner. I didn't think it through, didn't have anywhere to go. And I was just sofa surfing. And so I was basically homeless for a period of a couple of months. And it was like I carried on working for this Fortune 500. But eventually I was like, I moved out of London. Then I moved back. My father got cancer. And I went back to help his wife, my mother. Moved back to Portsmouth for 6 months, and then it was like, I have to get out of here, and I ended up in Africa, and working with a voluntary organisation, and I was there for about a year. But because I hadn't dealt with my stuff, I just got into drink, prostitutes, and I didn't treat myself very nicely at all. And at the end of that year, I was feeling a bit psychotic, to be honest.
I imagine, yeah. And it's a story that a lot of men have, is like, you try to change locations, or you try to get a new job or get a new wife or something, right? But like, unless you deal with that trauma, then it's going to just follow you, right? It haunts you no matter where you go. So when did you start working on it? I know we mentioned a little bit when I was on your show about you pursuing Buddhism and studying a spiritual path. Like, is that where that comes into this story, or what was your next step around? How did you start to heal from this?
Yeah, so I think it was 2001. I got back from Africa. Basically, I thought I was going insane. Had voices going around my head. And I got back from Africa. My aunt and my grandmother had died within a week. And I went back to look after my grandfather. So his sister and his wife had died within a week. And I was like, oh, I'll go and look after him. And while I was there, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm a mess. I need to look after myself now. And it was at that point, I'm like, oh, I'm going insane. And it's like, but then I did one more throw of the dice, and I went on a bender for 2 weeks up to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is pretty, lots of drinking. And then I spent a week in a pub, sleeping during the day, drinking all night. And after that, I was like, and I started to read Harry Potter. And Harry Potter's all about boarding school. Yeah, and it was like the psyche trying to integrate. And I was like, and after that week in the pub drinking, I was like, oh, I think I spent £1,000, so say $1,500 in a week on drink and drugs. And it was like, okay, I need some help. And it was at that point that I said, right, what I need is a space just to heal. And I found a retreat center. I went for 3 weeks to this retreat center. And while I was there, within 20 minutes of being in the retreat center, I came across 2 books from old boys from my boarding school. And one of them is this one here. Bede Griffiths, The Golden Stringer. So he's a Benedictine monk who went to go and set up an ashram in India. And he said some word about splitting off and, there being no space for emotion. And then there was another one, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet. So he was at my school, and he said some word quite derogatory about the school, and I'm like, oh my God, that... And so that just blew my mind, these really well-known people questioning it. And I was like, what was my boarding school like? And that was the piece which suddenly started to unravel, what was in my psyche. And so the next 3 weeks, I started to look, and I had so much anger. I hated the place, absolutely hated the place. And I just had not realized. And as I processed, I realized I was a mess, absolute mess. And I realized I needed to find a place where I could just work and have somewhere to live, was paid for. And the doors of the universe open, the synchronicities. One of the teachers at the retreat center was an ex-Buddhist monk. He says, "Oh, I know the abbot." Short story. I spoke to the abbot. He says, "We need help for the retreat." And I went up. I went for 10 days, took 2 bags, and I ended up staying for 1,000 days. So 3.5 years. I didn't leave. And it was at that point, one day I was seeing a therapist in the local town, and she said, "Right, you need to read this book called The Making of Them by Nick Duffel." And I'd never heard of it. She said it's all about boarding school. And I'm like, right. I made a mental note, but it went in one ear and went out the other. I got back to the monastery. I was going into my room, and there's a book in front of the door, and it's like this. It's upside down. And so I turned it this way up, and it's this book in front of my door. And one of the guys in my monastery, he'd also been to boarding school, and he'd been reading it, and he says, "Oh, I finished reading. I'll see if Piers wants to read it." So he passed it to me the very day, and it's like, da, 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 da. I'm like, oh my God. And so that's when I started to process, and I was working with this therapist for 6 months, and the abbot one day said, "Your therapy is not really working. I think you need to see this woman." And she was a Jungian analyst. She'd authored about 30 books. She was a supporter of the monastery, and she'd been a contemporary of Jung, friends of Agnella Jaffe, who was Jung's secretary. And he said, "You need to work with her." And so I did. I began to work with her, and for 2 years, I think for the first year, once a week, I would travel 7 hours there and back to do 3 or 4 hours of therapy with her, and then come back to the monastery. I should leave the monastery at 7, and I'd get back about 7 at night. So 7 in the morning till 7 at night, and because I was away for one work day, I'd have to work an extra day. So I was doing basically, it was intense. And at the end of about 18 months, I had a physical breakdown. I couldn't get out of bed. Chronic fatigue, ME. But I'd been self-harming. So I was physically beating myself. I had been cutting myself. There's so much anger bubbling up. And once I got the ME, I had no energy to cut myself anymore. So it was like a blessing. But it was a pain not being able to have any energy. But I hadn't taken care of myself.
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show. Right. Yeah. And all that shadow, all that trauma had to go somewhere. Right. So it sounds like it was just boiling over. Once you pop that pimple, all that poison was coming out. And it's wild. I mean, the story itself is not common, but the themes are common of like, the thing that was traumatic is like right there in front of your face, but there's all that, like you said, denial and dissociation and everything around it. And it's wild that like once you prick the hole in that and you let some light in, all of a sudden it was like flooding in. It's like, oh yeah, it was boarding school, the whole time. And you have to really connect with that. Yeah.
And then what happened is the emotions started to come in. I hadn't cried since that 11-year-old boy. And it was suddenly, oh my God, I started to grieve for my friend who committed suicide. I started to grieve for my father. I started to grieve for my other friend who died. And suddenly it was like, oh, I have permission. And I just had this image of I was the little boy, and I had this big figure around me, like my psyche, imagining my father just holding me going, "I've got you. You're safe now." And I could just let go and cry.
It's a beautiful image. And I like that you're highlighting, and I want to give you a chance to add more detail too of like what the healing process actually looks like. That it is messy and it is violent and it is like brutal, and I really am inspired by the vulnerability that you're showing here of sharing what that was like to really go through that. Because I think, I've had some other guests or other people where it's like, oh yeah, and then like I healed it and it was fine. Right? They kind of like glaze over kind of the nastiness that does happen in a healing process. So I like that you're sharing those ups and downs that you had in there.
Yeah, I mean, it was strange. It was a bit like I was reading Eckhart Tolle's experience of waking up. I had that experience, very similar to his in the monastery. So it was this bliss of, oh my God, kind of being in my darkest point where I couldn't, in the monasteries I lived in, a teacher called Ajahn Chah, used to say, when you can't go forward and you can't go back and you can't stand still, that's where you practice. And so there was one evening I was in absolute agony. I'd stopped talking to my parents. Oh, my father had died by that, so it was just my mother and my sister. So I couldn't look at the past because it was so painful. And I couldn't look at the future because there was no future. I wasn't talking to anyone. I had no friends, in the monastery. There was no future. And then the present was so painful. And I just had a moment where I just woke up. And I'm like, it was like bliss. It was really felt like Eckhart Tolle talks about that enlightenment. It was just beautiful. I had a few experiences like that. And then obviously it faded. And the abbot used to say, and I'd go and see the abbot. I'd say, oh, I had this experience. And I was expecting him to go, wow, it's amazing. And he'd go, so? What are we doing for breakfast? And I'm like, no, but you didn't hear. Because the teaching in Buddhism is that if you get attached to those enlightenment experiences, when the hell experiences come along, you get attached to that as well. And I got attached a lot. Some of the things I did during that time was I tried to slit my wrists twice. And then I was talking to one of the monks that I'd done this, and he said, do you know what the Buddhists believe about suicide? And I said, no. And he says, well, what they believe is that when you commit suicide, you then go into a hell realm, and you stay in that for a number of lifetimes because you are basically doing the worst thing ever to commit, to kill yourself, your own self. And I'm like, what? You mean the only way out of this fucking nightmare was to kill myself? And now you're telling me I can't even do that? I'm like, what? And so therefore I had to find that strength to go from the boy. It's like to that initiation into the man and go, okay, I have to find that resource. I have to find that strength within myself. And yeah, I think it is. It's incredibly messy. But I think what we often do, especially as ex-boarders, we try and do it on our own because that's what we were taught in these schools, which are why I've talked on my podcast, Richard Grannon, who's quite a well-known speaker on narcissism. And he went to boarding school himself, and he says boarding school creates narcissists because when we get there, we have no control of the external circumstances. The only thing we can control is ourselves. It's all about us. And therefore, when we leave, you can see this with people who have been to boarding school, is they're trying to amass stuff because without that, they don't exist. They don't have that full cup that Robert Moore talks about. There's the Grail cup within ourselves, in our psyche. It's got cracks. And therefore, we're trying to fill it all the time rather than just having this solid space to be able to hold, to be securely attached, and to be happy. If you're loved, you're happy. If you're not loved.
Yeah, say more about that. That's a great transition. That's what I was going to ask you, right, is like these borders that are unhealed, right? I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump, probably the most well-known one right now, right? But like, yeah, what is that? What does that create in these, boys and men's bodies out there in the world?
Yeah, so I mean, there's so many of them.
Yeah.
Like I said, if you read JFK's book, he had really bad homesickness. He also got really ill at boarding school. He was hospitalized quite a lot. And, for me, it's like I have a list on my website of about 20 characteristics. I've received so many dozens of emails, if not hundreds of emails over the years about all the people who come to me saying, oh my God, I said yes to every single question. Do you struggle in intimacy? Do you struggle with vulnerability? Do you struggle with sleep? Do you have addictions? So these are all the things. And what we see is, and whether it's boarding school or it's just trauma, is that it's these separate entities, and we go, oh, it's just me. But when you meet with other boarders and you're like, you've got exactly the same symptoms as me. And nearly everyone has the same thing: anxiety, stomach problems, because they're not relaxed. They weren't ever relaxed. It's kind of that holding on. Insomnia, as I said, struggling with intimacy, lack of emotional intelligence, lack of empathy. So what happens with the leaders, some of the most powerful people in the world, Rupert Murdoch, he went to boarding school. I think he was bullied at boarding school. Obviously, King Charles, he snored, so they'd be punched in the night. He said in his letters in this book here that it was absolute hell. He also called his boarding school Colditz in kilts. Boris Johnson, he went age 11, and because he was Turkish of origin, he was, I can't remember what he says. Basically, he created this persona, which is what we see Boris is now, in order to survive. David Cameron or Richard Branson as well. He was sexually abused at boarding school. He was also beaten until he because he was dyslexic, he was beaten until he bled once a week. He also tried to commit suicide at boarding school. And he wrote a suicide note, was walking towards the cliff to jump off. And the boy who had given the suicide note to looked at it and got the other students and a teacher to stop him. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Richard Branson. You've probably heard of Bear Grylls. He's had Barack Obama on his show. Now, what did he say in here? It's just fascinating just to read, and it's almost consistent every single time. He says, I meet a lot of folks nowadays who say how great boarding school is as a way of toughening up kids. That feels a bit back to front to me. I was much tougher before school. I'd learned to love the outdoors and to understand the wild and how to push myself. When I hit school, suddenly all I felt was fear. And you think this is seen as one of the toughest guys alive. And it is, and I have dozens of these books, and they've all got similar stories in them. So how that impacts us is, if we've learned to hate the vulnerable inside ourselves, as we do, the projection, we can't take care of the vulnerable in society. And we're seeing this a lot in the UK at the moment, is that, we're cutting winter allowances. So basically people are, not warm enough. There's not enough food. We're cutting benefits. Rather than taxing the rich, we're taxing the poor, basically. And so that's how it shows up, is that if we learn not to have empathy, and Nick Duffel again, he says that when you dissociate, it's very difficult, and this is Antonio Damasio as well. He's saying you can't make good decisions without emotional information. If you've dissociated, it's very short-termism. Okay, let's do the next 3-month shareholders, but we can't think what the First Nations do for the next 7 generations. How will that impact? We don't think that far, and that's partly because of the trauma. It's like we can't think that far ahead. And so there's many reasons, but, so many of our politicians or business leaders have been to boarding school. And obviously it's less of an impact in America because they go a lot later. It's 13 or 14. The head of the FBI, Christopher Wray, he was boarding school. Mark Zuckerberg, boarding school. I think the co-founder of LinkedIn, again, boarding school. it's a lot of the choate. Is it choate or chote?
Yep.
Choate. Yeah, I pronounced it wrong. Choate. You've got Phillips Academy, those types of places, which they're the elite institutions, and many of them are either senators or in positions of power.
Yeah, it's wild, and it's a really interesting through line. I mean, I really hope that you continue your work, and I'm curious if that does become the connector, because I mean, I haven't spoken with any billionaires, but from the outside looking in, it does seem like they have that lack of that cup, right, the grail, like you were talking about, and they have, even though they have so much financial abundance, they seem to really struggle with scarcity. I think they feel very scarce, and they feel like they have nothing to give, and they need to keep it all for themselves, and it's crazy. I mean, it is truly insane. And I'm just hearing that as a thread in this, right? This idea of, if you feel empty on the inside, no amount of money, success, or fame is going to fill that up. If you're fundamentally lonely, right, or fundamentally dissociated and just numb to the world.
Yeah, exactly. And I see it's like we've got a premiere in Scotland, and we're struggling to fill it at the moment. It's like, and it's to see that this is not just an issue of people who went to boarding school. Oh no, it's for people who are living in the world. If you look at lockdowns, certainly in Britain, we had 3 main people who were advising us. And we had Boris Johnson, went to age 11. You had Christopher Whitty, the medical doctor, he went age 8. And then you went Patrick Vallance, who was scientific advisor. He went to a boarding school. I don't know if he boarded. And as Jung said, the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Joy Chavrin says, ABCD of boarding school syndrome: abandonment. How many of us felt abandoned during lockdowns? B, bereaved. How many of us could not see our parents, especially when they were dying or whatever, or we couldn't see the old life, bereaved? C, captivity. We were held captive. We couldn't escape, which is what basically happened in boarding school. And then the D is dissociation. We had to learn to dissociate because we're locked in this house with our children and our spouse. We can't get away. And it's like, it might have nothing to do with lockdowns, but it's really interesting that our leaders who are advising us, in the UK, we had quite a lot of lockdowns. Many countries had one, and then they moved on, but we had, 3 or 4. And so it might have nothing to do with it. It might just be my own stuff, but it's just interesting to ask the question. Piecing Jung's work together with Joy's, you're like, wait a minute, could that have had anything to do? When so people say it's nothing to do with me, I'm like, well, I think it might do.
Yeah, when that's the solution, right? It's a very avoidant attachment style, right, or trauma-based solution. It's just isolate, cut off, and lock it down, right? Versus a more communal solution, right, or a more small pots of people, or everyone being more conscientious about health or hand washing or whatever it is, right? It's just nope, shut them down, separate them, right? Just put it in the box, and we'll pick it up in a couple months when this thing is all blown over.
Yeah, and then in the UK, what we had is, this is very much a boarding school thing. It was what we had in my boarding school is the prefects could do whatever they wanted. One rule for us, another rule for the people who are below us. And Boris Johnson and a lot of the politicians, they didn't follow any of the lockdown rules. They had parties, when we weren't allowed to go anywhere, and they did as they pleased. And it was like, they didn't wear masks or anything. And it's like, really?
Yeah, the same thing, with celebrities in the States, right? There was a lot of that, of just people just blatantly, ignoring what we were trying to all agree on. As we're wrapping up here, I think we talked about a little bit on your show, but I just want to get on this recording too, is is there a future, do you think, for the boarding school industry, or do you advocate for it just to be disbanded, or is there a chance for reform? What should happen with all this? Because these are major institutions. So how should they change?
Great question, Mark. For me, they don't have a place. I've spoken to 130 people on my podcast. I've read 50 biographies. nearly all of them have a really horrific story, from rape to, suicide attempts. And I think, yes, they've changed. They are now better manned. The teachers are generally not paedophiles, which is really good. But there's peer-on-peer abuse still going on to this day. And it's like, there's still no parents. You're still breaking the attachment. And my wish, and this is my vision, is by 2035, all boarding schools will close under 16, or be converted into secondary schools, where you go home. I think they have the resources there. And then sixth form, it'd be heart-centered, emotionally intelligent spaces for creating, the leaders of the future. As a boarding, that's good. From 16 onwards, you've already created those attachments, as long as they're good spaces. Because I've worked with people who went to boarding school age 16 up, and they were sexually abused, and this affected them all their life. So that's my vision. And for me, if we come back to that emotionally intelligent piece, that the IQ is going to take that, the AI is going to take that IQ piece out. So what's going to be important is the EQ. You don't get that in a boarding school, because you get that from your parents. So therefore, for me, it's not that they will be forced to close. They will become obsolete. It's like the best companies will not want to hire someone who has no heart. They will not, the last words of Kouzes and Posner's leadership challenge, which is the Bible, it says leadership's all about love. If you've learned to hate and that part of yourself, you can't be a leader in the future. The command and control style of leadership is gone now, and it's the emotionally intelligent which is thriving. The companies which are embracing this, they're the ones that are like, it's too complex now, leadership, to have command and control. And people are, the young generation aren't willing to work for these people. They just walk out.
Yeah. I mean, the young generation, we have much more complex emotional needs that we expect to be met, and to be talked about. But Piers, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show. If people want to learn more about you, if they want to watch the documentary, where can they find all that stuff online? Yeah,
thank you. Well, bless you for your work and amazing work you're doing, and thank you for speaking. It's been a real pleasure. So my website is piers-cross.com. That's for my one-to-one coaching, and my podcast is on there. And then the documentary is boardingoninsanity.com. You can watch it there. You can watch the trailer on YouTube. It has Gabor Mate in it. It has Nick Duffel. It has Joy Chavrian, many others, developmental psychologists. And please feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Well, listeners, check all that stuff out. That will all be in the show notes. Especially if you know anybody that's been to boarding school, or you've been to boarding school yourself and you haven't really spoken about it, I think Piers is a phenomenal resource for that. It sounds like there's a lot of benefit to be had of talking with someone that's been through it in a way, because it does seem like a pretty unique experience. So Piers, again, thank you so much for the work that you do. And listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. If you like it, do all the social stuff, like, share, subscribe, send it out to somebody that you think could benefit from hearing the conversation. And we'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.